The dust is finally beginning to settle, and we are so close to completing the launch of our rebrand here at Math Science History. However, we still have just a little bit more to do. As a result, I will be posting another repost for this week for Black History Month. Today's post is actually one of my favorites, and it's about Dr. Roger Arliner Young. She was the first Black American woman to get her doctorate in zoology. Her story is an amazing one because she was exceptionally resilient and steadfast in receiving her PhD. The road wasn't easy considering the extensive race and gender bias in the 1930s. And the road still isn't easy because we are facing even more gender and race bias even today, almost 100 years later. So her story resonates profoundly, not just during Black History Month, but as we approach Women's History Month in March. She was dedicated to science. She loved zoology. And this story will show you just that. Thank you for your patience during our construction. But it's exciting. And thank you for listening. In the year 415, the infamous philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria, Egypt, was savagely murdered by church monks. This murder shocked the Roman community and its government leaders. Hypatia was known far and wide as a respected philosopher, mathematician, government advisor, and a professor. Hypatia, The Sum of Her Life, is a book that I wrote that looks not just at the circumstances surrounding her death, but also at the sum of her entire life. I weave in the details of her education, disciples, Neoplatonic philosophies, female contemporaries, and the many mathematics that she wrote and taught about. There is truly more to Hypatia's life than her death. Hypatia, The Sum of Her Life, written by me, Gabrielle Burchak, is now on sale on Amazon. Buy your copy today. Join me in celebrating Black History Month. So many incredible stories about perseverance, dedication, hard work, humanism, empathy, and brilliance are shared throughout the entire month celebrating Black culture. For the month of February, I've decided to do a series of podcasts honoring the brilliant, Black, badass goddesses who continue to forge paths for the marginalized in STEM. Every week, I will be doing a podcast on a super shero in STEM who deserves to be recognized for her rise in STEM. This week, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Roger Arliner Young. Dr. Young was born in Clifton Forge, Virginia in 1889. Shortly after, her and her family moved to Burgettstown, Pennsylvania. Her family wasn't affluent. They weren't even middle class. They were poor. However, this did not stop Young from pursuing her dreams, which were originally in music. I love this tidbit about her, where she wrote in her yearbook that not failure, but low aim is a crime, and she aimed high. Academically, she struggled. She had been studying music at Howard University for 5 years. Then, in 1921, she took her first science class. At this point, Young had hit her stride. She knew what she wanted to study, and she knew what she wanted to be, and she never wavered in her determination. She fell in love with zoology. She was enthralled with the scientific study of animal life, the structures, the physiology, the resilience, the evolution, the behavior, and the survival of animals from their cellular level to their powerful, profound existence in the world. After that class, for the next 2 years, she studied from Dr. Ernest Everett Just, who was an influential Black biologist and the head of the zoology department at Howard. Just saw intelligence and aptitude in Young. Even her classmates characterized her as lively and vivacious. She was involved in different college organizations, including Glee Club, Young Women's Christian Association, and Howard University Players, which is a student-run performing arts group. So, she was not only talented, she discovered that she was smart. 2 years after choosing zoology as her field of study, She graduated with her bachelor's degree. Then she wrote her first and only sole published paper titled On the Excretory Apparatus in Paramecium. It was published in the September 12, 1924 edition of Science magazine. This was a magazine that even accomplished scientists have minimal success of being published in. It was a tremendous success for Young. She was the first Black woman to research and publish in the field of zoology. Young was eager to go on to graduate school for her master's, and so just tried to help her find funding, but to no avail. Nevertheless, Young was unstoppable. She knew what she wanted, and she pursued it. So, in 1924, she enrolled at the University of Chicago on a part-time basis. 2 years later, she graduated with her master's in zoology. While at the University of Chicago, her grades improved even more so much that she was elected to the Sigma Xi Honorary Society, which was quite an accomplishment because in order to be invited to the Sigma Xi Honorary Society, one had to already be a doctoral candidate, and she wasn't. She was still working on her master's. After she received her master's, Just hired Young to assist him as a professor of zoology in his department at Howard University. So, back at Howard University, she worked with Just, helping him to manage the workload with his classes and assisting him in the lab. She also worked with him as his research assistant at the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole, Massachusetts for 2 years between 1927 and 1929. While at Woods Hole, she found a second home. For the next 9 years, she would visit Woods Hole and work in the laboratory every summer. This opportunity at Woods Hole was quite an accomplishment. She was the first Black woman to join the scientific community in Woods Hole. However, there was still a lot of interracial bias at this time. In addition, Young had realized that some of her challenges weren't just because she was Black, but that she was also a woman. Nevertheless, she continued in her research and gained the respect of many of her peers and their mentors. From 1927 to 1928, Just had been developing new research that included the effect of ultraviolet light on the development of marine eggs. So, after her master's degree, she was back at Howard working for Just, but her workload was tremendous, especially after Just traveled to Europe on a research grant. She carried his workload and seized every spare minute that she had to write proposals for funding so that she could continue in her doctoral studies. Despite the workload, she kept moving forward. In the summer of 1929, Young went to Woods Hole, where she worked alongside embryologist Frank Lilly from the University of Chicago. This was an advantageous summer for her. The General Educational Board rewarded her with the fellowship so that she could continue with her doctoral studies. Shortly after Just returned from England, Young left for the University of Chicago to study from Lilly and prepare for her qualifying exams in order to enter her doctoral studies. In January 1930, just 1 week before Young was to take her qualifying exams, Just left for Europe again. She was overwhelmed taking on Just's duties and preparing for her exams, and she was struggling physically. The work with ultraviolet light that she had been doing for Just had permanently damaged her eyes. She was also struggling financially because she solely carried the financial burden of taking care of her mother, who was very sick. She didn't have enough money for research, travel, or her family. She, like so many other graduate students, suffered the emotional and physical demands of America's academia that seldom provides a healthy work-life balance. And so she failed the qualifying exams. The University of Chicago denied her acceptance. Then things got worse. Because she was denied acceptance to the University of Chicago, her place at Howard became precarious. Just and the president of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson, had plans in place for the zoology department. The department had been awarded a grant of $80,000. That's a lot of money for 1930. They had assumed that Young would complete her PhD and then return to help the department flourish. However, after being denied by Chicago, Young was emotionally shattered. She wrote to Dr. Lilly upon her departure, saying, quote, "The trouble is that for 2 years, I've tried to keep going under responsibilities that were not wholly mine, but were not shared, and the weight of it has simply worn me out," unquote. In short, Young was exhausted. Nevertheless, back at Howard, she kept moving forward. That summer of 1930, she went to Woods Hole to work in the lab alongside Dr. V.L. Heilbrunn of the University of Pennsylvania and his student Donald P. Costello. All three worked together conducting marine egg studies. From 1931 to 1935, Young's position at Howard became difficult and questionable to the university. Despite the fact that Just had convinced Young to stay at Howard, even though she was offered a position at Spelman College in 1931, their working relationship fell apart. Just had been ignoring her and treating her coldly. Meanwhile, Johnson, Howard's president, informed Just that he needed to make budget cuts and to let one of his 3 junior professors go. So, when Young confronted Just about his attitude towards her, he impulsively fired her. Winnie Warren, she is the author of the book Black Women Scientists in the United States. It's a wonderful book. She explains it perfectly, where she writes, quote, "Perhaps one of the most crucial elements in Young's fate at Howard University was that the school's power elite was not particularly supportive of women during this period," unquote. So Young had so much going for her, but like many Black women, even today, her career suffered because of marginalization and gender bias. Again, that didn't stop her. She kept going. She continued to work with Heilbrunn and Costello, and together, the 3 of them wrote 3 papers for Biological Bulletin that were published in 1935, 1938, and 1939. In 1937, she was accepted into the doctoral program at the University of Pennsylvania and received a 2-year grant from the General Education Board to study there. She finally earned her doctorate. Shortly after that, she obtained a position at North Carolina College for Negroes in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then, after that, she was hired on as the head of the biology department at Shaw University. In 1947, she went back to North Carolina College as a biology professor. Unfortunately, though, she could never get ahead of her financial difficulties. She could no longer afford to go to Woods Hole to conduct any more research. Also, North Carolina and Shaw could not afford the research equipment necessary for her to carry out research at the school. In 1953, her mother passed away. This shattered her. Emotionally, she couldn't rationalize. She began to have a psychological breakdown and a financial breakdown as co-workers whispered about her mental state. Broken and distressed, she checked herself into the Mississippi Mental Asylum in Whitfield. Even though she was discharged in 1962 and held a position as a temporary visiting lecturer at the Southern University in Louisiana, she continued to struggle with emotional stability. Winnie Warren writes that perhaps her 10-year working relationship with Just did not enable her to outgrow her dependence on her mentor. Perhaps she had become so reliant on her mentor that she had been conditioned to not think for herself. Based on her confidence and determination in her undergraduate years, if she had been weaned off of the enabling of her mentor, she might have overcome the challenges that academia and life presented her with. And because of that, and again, I have to say, the lack of work-life balance in academia, because of that, Young couldn't quite overcome her personal difficulties. She might have taken that position at Spelman College in 1931. She might have lived a different life. She might have found her niche and success in academia. On November 9, 1964, Dr. Roger Arliner Young passed away in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was the first Black American woman to get her doctorate in zoology. She didn't just forge a path for Black women in zoology, she blazed it. She was a scientist in an age long before civil rights. She overcame numerous obstacles to pursue her dreams. Every day, as she found joy in discovery, she had to push against the world of academia that held onto the antiquated belief that women didn't belong in the field of science. And when some of her pursuits failed, she simply tried again. She had tenacity, determination, and grit. She never gave up on her dream to get her doctorate and do her research. When her personal situations became enormously difficult, the science that she loved so much gave her hope. Thank you for joining me at Math Science History. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Also, if you could leave a rating or a review, I would truly appreciate that. Those ratings and reviews really help to increase my listenership, which help me get more sponsors and advertisers, which help me keep the podcast up and running. If you want to learn more about the history of math and science, please visit me at mathsciencehistory.com. There you can find the transcripts and additional information to each topic, as well as additional links to other sites. Oh, and hey, if you like what you're listening to and you like what you're reading, please feel free to click on that cup of coffee and make a donation to the podcast, because every cup of coffee that you buy helps me to pay for the expenses that go into making this podcast. If you would like an early peek and listen to the podcast, you can follow me on Patreon, where you can choose a tier or even pick your own price. Or you can also subscribe to Math Science History on Medium, where you can read an early release of the podcast, which includes the math. Also, if you're interested in having me speak at your school or your event, please visit me at GabrielleBurchak.com. I would love to come share the world of math, science, and history with you, your audience, and your students. Finally, if you're interested in leaving me a comment or submitting a podcast topic, you can always find me and Math Science History on your preferred platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or you can just search the Googly for Gabrielle Burchak. Until next time, carpe diem.